Hey guys, tonight we begin with something you were definitely not taught in school. Imagine trying to fall asleep in a cave where the air is thick with smoke, the floor writhes with insects, and the only thing standing between you and a hungry predator is a half-burned log. This was bedtime for your ancestors. No castles, no crowns, no cozy furs, just fear, fleas, and the birth of humanity's very first nightmares. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your bed isn't a bed. It's a pile of rotting grass and old animal hides that smell like wet dog, if the dog had been left outside in the rain for a week and then rolled in something decomposing. Fleas jump across your ankles before you even sit down. Lice are already setting up their nightlife in your hair. And the smoke from the fire you dragged into the cave is so thick, you feel like you're trying to nap inside a chimney. There are no pillows. The nearest thing to memory foam is a lump of moss that smells suspiciously like urine. Egyptian cotton sheets? Those won't be invented for another 38,000 years. Right now, you're pulling an animal skin over yourself that hasn't been washed since the Ice Age began, and it weighs roughly as much as a small reindeer from the layers of grease and dirt caked into it. You blink as the fire crackles in the corner. It's supposed to be comforting, but the cave walls are blackened with soot from countless nights just like this. You're choking on your own security system, and outside, beyond the glow, you can hear it, the low growl of something pacing. Wolf? Hyena? Lion? Doesn't matter. They're all hungry. Here's the historical kicker. Archaeologists have found soot layers deep inside ancient caves, proof that early humans burned fire indoors not just for warmth, but to keep predators away at night. Clever idea, except the smoke poisoned their lungs and scrambled their sleep cycles. Breathing wood smoke all night meant shallow sleep, restless dreams, and eventually nightmares. In other words, the first human nightmares weren't just random bad dreams. They were the brain's twisted way of saying, hey, wake up, there's probably something out there that wants to eat you. Your subconscious literally became the world's first burglar alarm, except instead of a siren, it gave you sweaty visions of glowing eyes and sharp teeth. Think of it like the prehistoric version of a baby monitor, only instead of listening for a crying infant, your brain jolted you awake because it thought a saber-toothed cat was auditioning for dinner. And if you've ever woken up at 3 a.m, convinced you heard something in the dark, congratulations, you're still carrying the same neurological baggage as your caveman ancestors. Of course, fire wasn't the only sleep hazard. Bedding itself was a disaster. Cavemen lined cave floors with layers of grass and ash, hoping it would keep away insects. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The ash may have slowed down some bugs, but it also created a crunchy mattress that left you feeling like you'd slept on gravel. Archaeologists have literally found 70,000-year-old beds made from decomposed plant matter and ash. They were about as cozy as camping on a compost pile. Add in the constant threat of predators, the damp chill of the cave, and the fact that your bedding doubled as a flea colony, and you get why caveman sleep was restless. Nightmares were less about dream interpretation and more about surviving long enough to wake up. And here you are, trying to drift off, only to find your lungs burning from smoke, your skin crawling with fleas, and your brain dragging you into another nightmare about something with claws. You gasp awake, sweating, and realize the real horror isn't in your head. It's the glowing eyes just outside the cave, waiting for the fire to die down. Congratulations. You've just experienced humanity's first sleep paralysis demon, and it had teeth. But if you think nightmares were the worst part of bedtime, just wait until you find out what cavemen used for pillows. Because once you see those, you'll be begging to sleep on a medieval haystack. So let's talk about your pillow, or rather, the object pretending to be your pillow. In the Stone Age, resting your head was less about comfort and more about not accidentally suffocating yourself. Archaeologists have found evidence that early humans sometimes used stones, logs, or bundles of grass to prop up their heads. Imagine ending your day by gently lowering your skull onto a rock and convincing yourself that this was an upgrade. Smooth, flat stones were actually favoured by some prehistoric groups because they lifted the face away from insects crawling on the ground. In other words, your ancestors slept on rocks not for comfort, but to avoid waking up with ants in their mouths. Of course, grass bundles were popular too, which sounds like an improvement, until you remember that grass in the Stone Age was rarely clean. It was often stuffed with bits of ash, dirt, and whatever insects refused to evacuate. By the time morning came, your pillow was crawling with lice, mites, and beetles. Modern humans fluff pillows to make them softer. Cavemen probably fluffed theirs to chase out spiders, and even that did not always work. A warm, grassy clump of bedding was basically a buffet line for vermin. Another strange choice was animal bones. In some early societies, curved bones were used as neck rests. Similar bone or wooden headrests later appeared in ancient Egypt and China, so the logic seems to have been universal. The raised head prevented smothering on the uneven ground, and allowed air to circulate in sweltering climates. But picture trying to fall asleep with your head balanced on the curve of a rib bone. Restful sleep was less likely than a stiff neck and a concussion. Yet these primitive contraptions became the prototype for the earliest pillows, which makes you wonder how long it took humanity to realise that stuffing cloth with feathers was the superior option. Now let's address sleeping positions. You may curl up under your blanket in whatever position you like, but in a smoky, flea-ridden cave you did not have much choice. Prehistoric humans often slept in huddles, pressed together for warmth like sardines in an ashtray. Sleeping alone was dangerous. It left you exposed to the cold and to predators, so people formed tight clusters, often back to back or facing inward toward the fire. This was not about bonding or affection. It was survival through body heat. And while you may think group cuddling sounds sweet, imagine 10 people all coated in sweat, grease, and smoke, twitching in their nightmares and elbowing you in the ribs through the night. There is also evidence that prehistoric sleep was segmented. Anthropologists believe that early humans did not sleep in one long stretch, but in 2 or even 3 chunks. You might doze lightly at the fire's edge, wake up to throw on more wood or swat away pests, then collapse again for another bout of shallow rest. This fragmented sleep is thought to have influenced the way modern humans still wake up in the middle of the night for no clear reason. The next time you find yourself staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m, you can thank cavemen who set the biological template by never truly sleeping deeply. Constant danger made them restless, and evolution passed that down like an unwanted family heirloom. What about dreams? Prehistoric people may not have written down their thoughts, but many anthropologists believe that nightmares were the birthplace of early myth. When your entire group wakes up shrieking about shadowy creatures at the cave entrance, eventually someone decides the shadows must be real. These collective fears may have contributed to the birth of spiritual beliefs, taboos, and early rituals. Nightmares were not just private terrors, they were public events that shaped group identity. Dreaming of monsters in the dark may have laid the groundwork for the first oral legends of spirits and demons. In this sense, nightmares were not just brain static, they were building blocks of culture. And here is the absurd part. Your brain did not just invent random horrors, it recycled the very real threats of your environment. If you were mauled by a wild cat during the day, your nightmares replayed that experience at night. The brain stored traumatic memories to keep you alert. So in a twisted way, nightmares were prehistoric safety drills. They prepared you for the worst case scenario, even if it meant you never truly rested. Night terrors were training modules for survival, complete with cold sweats and jolting wake-ups. Try to imagine yourself wedged in that smoky cave, head balanced awkwardly on a rock or clump of grass, pressed against the sweaty shoulder of someone who has not bathed since birth. The air is a choking haze. Your chest feels heavy. You cough into the blanket that smells of damp fur and ash. You try to shift into a more comfortable position, but comfort is a fantasy. Your knees dig into stone. a beetle crawls along your arm, and your dreams drag you once again into a half-conscious world of snarling teeth. The entire concept of sleep, something we now associate with peace and rest, was in the Stone Age a nightly rehearsal for fear. This is the origin of your restless nights. Every time you wake up sweaty, heart racing, convinced you heard something, you're replaying the same survival mechanisms that evolved in those caves. The human brain learned that safety was an illusion after dark. It trained itself to jolt you awake at the slightest hint of danger. And while today the worst thing pacing outside your home is probably the neighbour's cat, your mind still treats it like a saber-toothed tiger. And as bad as the pillars were, the caves themselves offered no mercy. Some caves had ceilings dripping with moisture, coating your bedding in damp slime by morning. Others had drafts so cold they could chill you to the bone even when pressed against your group. People adapted by layering hides over the cave floor, but that only created a musty, mould-soaked rug that reeked worse with every passing week. You're not just sleeping on nature, you're sleeping in nature's compost bin. This was the reality of prehistoric sleep. No privacy, no silence, no deep rest, and certainly no sweet dreams. Only clusters of people jammed together in caves, heads resting on rocks, lungs full of smoke, and brains conjuring nightmares as practice for staying alive. And the irony is that these miserable conditions rewired the human brain so completely that even now, with memory foam and air purifiers and blackout curtains, we still wake up in the night as if a lion were pacing outside the firelight. And yet, believe it or not, the situation gets even worse when you look at how cavemen handled bedding itself. Because while rocks made for terrible pillows, what they stuffed underneath their bodies might have been even more disgusting. And yet, lying on a rock was only part of the suffering. The real horror was under your body, not beneath your head. Cavemen had to invent bedding, but their idea of bedding would make a medieval haystack look like luxury. Archaeological digs in South Africa have uncovered layered mats of decomposed grasses and reeds inside caves, some of them dating back more than 70,000 years. This sounds like innovation until you picture lying down on a giant compost heap. These mattresses were rarely replaced, meaning they quickly turned into mouldy insect farms. The soft crackle under your back was not comfort. It was dried leaves breaking apart and releasing bugs. Researchers also found that ash was deliberately spread under these beds. At first glance, this looks ingenious. Ash repels insects, creating a kind of primitive bug spray. But ash also clings to skin, fills lungs, and cakes into the hair and fur of anyone unlucky enough to roll around in it. Imagine turning over in your sleep and waking up with your nose, mouth and ears clogged in soot. Every inhale felt like a drag of cigarette smoke, but without the nicotine buzz. That combination of ash and damp grass may have helped keep ticks and lice at bay for a few hours, but it came at the price of hacking coughs and irritated eyes. Sleep was meant to be recovery, but in caves it was a nightly respiratory hazard. Grass itself was never clean. It was dragged in from riverbanks or fields, already crawling with beetles and larvae. Once inside the dark, damp environment of the cave, it became the perfect breeding ground for parasites. Modern experiments have shown that grass bedding can attract mites within days. Cavemen had no concept of sanitation, so the same rotting layers piled up for weeks or months, absorbing sweat, grease, and urine. By the time winter ended, their beds were ecosystems of fungi and insects. This was the true first habitat of house pests, long before houses existed. Of course, bedding was not just about comfort, it was about survival. Sleeping on bare stone in a cave robbed the body of heat, pulling warmth away through conduction. Even in warmer regions, nights could be freezing, and without bedding, hypothermia was a real danger. Grass, hides, and even heaps of leaves acted as insulation. In a sense, these disgusting beds were life-saving. They trapped body heat, especially when whole groups huddled together on the same layers. Anthropologists believe this is one of the reasons early humans were able to spread into colder climates. They turned piles of mouldy grass into survival technology. But the downside was disease. Dense bedding that absorbed bodily fluids and food scraps became a haven for bacteria. Respiratory infections were likely worsened by inhaling spores from mouldy plant matter. Some scientists argue that chronic exposure to smoke and rotting grass played a role in shaping the immune systems of prehistoric humans, essentially forcing adaptation to a toxic environment. Your modern allergies and asthma may, in part, be genetic souvenirs from ancestors who spent every night breathing mildew in the dark. The use of animal hides only added to the misery. Furs were never properly cleaned. Once dried, they stiffened with grease and sweat, cracking at the edges and shedding hair everywhere. Every shift in the night left you coated in animal dander, which in turn attracted more insects. Think of your favourite blanket today. Now imagine if it smelled like rancid fat and made you sneeze until your eyes watered. So while your head may be resting on a rock or a bundle of itchy grass, your body is dealing with something far worse. Caveman bedding was a biological nightmare before nightmares even had a name. Archaeologists studying caves in South Africa uncovered bedding that dates back nearly 200,000 years. These so-called mattresses were layers of grass mixed with ash, spread directly on the cave floor. The ash was not an accident. People knew that ash kept away crawling insects like fleas and ticks. In theory, this was clever. In practice, it created a crunchy, dirty surface that disintegrated quickly and filled your lungs with fine dust every time you shifted. Imagine turning over in your sleep and getting a mouthful of fireplace sweepings. Over time, these layers of bedding built up into what scientists call cultural deposits. That is a polite term for enormous piles of rotting grass mixed with human debris. Excavations have revealed cave floors stacked with bedding layers like an archaeological lasagna of decay. Every few weeks, new grass would be laid over the old, but the underlying layers never disappeared. They compressed, decomposed, and attracted more insects. By the time you lay down, you were not just sleeping on grass, you were sleeping on years of compacted dirt, ash, and prehistoric sweat. It was less of a bed, and more of a compost heap with aspirations. The smell would have been staggering. Without soap, detergent, or ventilation, the bedding quickly reeked of smoke, mould, and unwashed human bodies. Some scientists believe that the smoke from fire combined with decomposing bedding created a kind of fumigation effect that reduced pests. That may have been true, but it also meant you were slowly poisoning yourself night after night. Inhaling mould spores and smoke together is not a recipe for restful dreams. It is a recipe for chronic coughing, lung damage, and possibly the very hallucinations that fueled the invention of nightmares in the first place. The insect problem deserves its own attention. Bedding made of grass and leaves was paradise for parasites. Fleas thrived in the warm layers. Lice spread easily between huddled bodies pressed together on shared bedding. Mites multiplied in the fibres. You might think your mattress attracts dust mites today, but prehistoric beds were entire ecosystems. By morning, your skin would be crawling with bites, and your scalp would feel like it had hosted an insect festival. Parasites were so common in prehistory that some scientists suggest human immune systems were permanently shaped by the constant exposure. Nightmares of bugs crawling on your skin were probably not dreams at all. They were accurate, real-time sensory experiences. If this was not enough, bedding was often damp. Caves were rarely dry, and condensation dripped steadily from ceilings. Grass bedding soaked up moisture and held it, creating an environment where mould flourished. You know the smell of a wet towel left in a gym bag for a week? Multiply that by centuries of cave life. Now imagine breathing it in every night. Some caves still reek faintly of ancient bedding layers, even after thousands of years. The musty stench lingers in stone like a memory. The real danger, however, was disease. Bedding layered with ash, waste, and rotting organic matter was a breeding ground for pathogens. Modern scientists studying ancient cave bedding have identified traces of bacteria and fungi capable of causing illness. Sleeping on these beds was not only uncomfortable, it was hazardous to your health. Respiratory infections, skin conditions and fevers would have been common, and since people slept in tight groups, disease spread like wildfire. A cough from one sleeper meant a cave full of hacking lungs by morning. Consider also the sheer lack of personal space. Prehistoric people huddled together on shared bedding, pressed shoulder to shoulder for warmth. Privacy did not exist. You woke up in the middle of the night with someone's foot in your ribs, someone else's breath in your face, and a handful of lice that had migrated onto your scalp. Your bedding was not your own. It was communal, filthy, and alive. Nightmares of suffocating, drowning, or being crushed might have stemmed from the suffocating press of bodies in the dark. The line between dream and reality blurred when every sense was overwhelmed by discomfort. And yet, for all its misery, bedding mattered. The effort to layer grass, ash, and hides shows that people valued sleep enough to try to make it bearable. It was an early form of technology, a prehistoric version of interior design. Cavemen were not simply collapsing on bare stone. They were experimenting, adapting, and learning how to manage their environment. The fact that we have evidence of bedding this old means that comfort, however small, was a human concern from the very beginning. You might call it the first step toward the luxury of modern mattresses, though one might argue memory foam was worth waiting 200,000 years for. Now picture yourself lying down in that mess. The grass beneath you is damp and brittle. The ash makes your skin itch. Fleas are biting at your ankles. Someone's elbow digs into your side as the smoke burns your throat. Your lungs wheeze, your eyes sting, and in the background the fire pops as the cave drips steadily. You roll over to find a spider nestled in your bedding. Your mind drifts into a dream where you are buried alive, suffocated by dirt and smoke. You jerk awake only to realize it was not a dream at all. You're living inside the perfect incubator for nightmares, where sleep itself feels like a gamble you never fully win. And while the bedding was bad enough, what happened when you tried to sleep through the sounds outside the cave made things even worse. Because predators were not just part of the environment, they were the night shift managers of your subconscious. And while the bedding beneath you is crawling with insects and stinking of mould, the real reason you cannot fall fully asleep is pacing just outside the cave. Predators were the original soundtrack to the human night, and they turned darkness into a stage where every sound fed your imagination. Archaeologists studying ancient ecosystems know that lions, leopards, hyenas, and wolves were all common across prehistoric Europe, Asia, and Africa. They hunted mostly at night, which meant that every flicker of movement beyond the fire was a reminder that you were on the menu. Lions in the Pleistocene were not like the lions of today. The cave lion, Panthera leospalea, was one of the largest cats ever to live. Some estimates suggest they were up to 10% bigger than modern lions, making them more than capable of dragging human away with little effort. Their bones have been found scattered in the same caves where humans lived, proof that both species fought for the same nighttime shelter. Imagine lying on your damp bedding, heart pounding, knowing that a creature twice your size once considered this very cave a bachelor pad. That knowledge alone is enough to give your subconscious something terrifying to work with. And then there were the hyenas. Today we laugh at their giggles, but back then, spotted hyenas were apex predators, capable of crushing bones with jaws stronger than a modern lion's. Their whooping calls carried through the night like a nightmare laugh track. For early humans huddled in smoky caves, the sound of a hyena's cackle was not funny. It was psychological torture, a reminder that scavengers were waiting for the fire to burn out. These calls may have fed directly into dreams, replayed as shrieking echoes in the brain until they became visions of spirits, demons, or monsters in the dark. Wolves were another problem. They hunted in packs, circling silently around firelight, waiting for an opportunity. The flickering shadows on the walls of a cave may have tricked the eye into seeing movement where there was none. This kind of visual confusion is fertile ground for nightmares. Your brain registers fear, adds the sound of padded feet, and then delivers a dream where glowing eyes approach, and teeth snap shut. Nightmares are not abstract creations, they are direct responses to environmental threats, and few things are more threatening than the synchronized hunger of a wolf pack in winter. Fire helped, but only to a point. Charred remains show that humans deliberately built fires at cave entrances to deter predators. The light and smoke created a protective barrier, but the brain never trusted it completely. Even as you drifted into shallow sleep, part of your nervous system remained on guard, tuned to the crack of a twig or the snap of a bone outside. Anthropologists believe this hypervigilance created what is known as first sleep and second sleep. The body would rest briefly, then wake to check the surroundings before collapsing again. That cycle, broken and uneasy, fostered dreams filled with watchfulness and dread. Some of the earliest myths about monsters may trace directly back to these nights. If you and your group are constantly awakened by the silhouette of a lion passing near the firelight, it is only natural to start imagining that the creature is larger, darker, or even supernatural. Over generations, these exaggerated visions became part of oral storytelling. Nightmares of giant cats and shadowy hunters eventually morphed into folklore about demons in the night. In this way, predators not only shaped our dreams, they shaped human culture itself. The strangest part is that predators also shaped human cooperation. Sleeping in groups was not just about warmth, it was about defense. If one person jolted awake from a nightmare about a stalking animal, their shout might rouse the others in time to throw more wood on the fire. This accidental alarm system turned bad dreams into community survival tools. Even paranoia had evolutionary benefits. The fact that you wake up at 3 a.m. to check your phone or stare into the dark is not random. It is an echo of the instinct that once saved lives by preparing groups to face nocturnal threats. Try to put yourself back there. You're lying in your smoky cave, pressed between family members, eyes stinging from the fire, your ears twitch at every sound. A growl echoes in the distance, followed by laughter that does not belong to humans. Your muscles tense, your breath quickens, and even though your eyes shut, your brain stages a rehearsal of being attacked. You dream of claws scraping stone, of teeth sinking into flesh, of shadows entering the cave. You jolt awake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, and realize that the dream was not a warning of some imagined beast. It was your nervous system practicing for the moment the real thing lunges from the dark. Predators forced humanity to evolve restless sleep. Those who slept too deeply risked never waking up. Those who dreamed of danger and stirred awake often survived. This is why nightmares persist even today. They are evolutionary leftovers, training exercises written into the human nervous system by millennia of sleeping with lions outside the door. It was never about psychology in the modern sense. It was about survival rehearsals disguised as horror stories. And as terrifying as the predators were, they were not the only threats keeping humans awake. The cave itself held dangers that transformed the act of sleeping into another source of nightmares. From collapsing ceilings to suffocating smoke, the very shelter that kept you alive during the day became another hazard in the dark. The cave that seemed like protection by day became a trap by night. Step inside and you quickly realize that this was not some cozy stone bedroom. It was a geological death trap with a roof. Caves often had ceilings that dripped with constant moisture, walls that echoed every sound until it was magnified tenfold, and drafts that turned the space into a natural wind tunnel. Sleeping inside meant that the smallest noise could turn into a booming roar, and a dripping stalactite could sound like the footsteps of something stalking you in the dark. No wonder the human brain began to conjure terrors. The setting practically begged for them. Archaeologists studying Paleolithic caves have uncovered blackened ceilings from thousands of fires, but they have also found collapsed sections where early humans once lived. That meant choosing a cave was a gamble. If it kept out the rain and predators, it also risked crushing you in your sleep. Many caves were unstable, made of brittle limestone or sandstone that broke loose with time. Imagine lying down to sleep and wondering not only if lions would drag you out, but if the ceiling itself would flatten you before sunrise. Those anxieties surely made their way into dreams, creating the earliest night terrors of falling, suffocating, or being buried alive. The air inside was hardly better. Fires lit inside caves produced smoke that had nowhere to escape. Even with openings at both ends, the heavy smoke pooled in pockets where people slept. Modern experiments show that caves filled with wood smoke can reach toxic levels of carbon monoxide. That means many of the headaches, nausea, and hallucinations people experienced at night were not purely psychological. They were symptoms of gas poisoning. In other words, nightmares were not just evolutionary rehearsals. They were chemically induced visions brought on by inhaling toxic fumes in a poorly ventilated stone chamber. Caves were also magnets for other animals. Archaeologists have found overlapping layers of human and bear habitation, meaning that some groups of people literally bedded down in dens that had once belonged to bears. Bears hibernate, but not every cave was permanently abandoned. Occasionally, a human group might return to find that a cave had been reclaimed by its original furry tenant. You can imagine the kind of nightmare this inspired. Dreams of being mauled in your sleep were not exaggerations. They were memories of events that actually happened. The acoustics of caves made everything worse. A cough could echo back as if 10 people had coughed in unison. The faint scrape of a rodent on stone could bounce through the chamber until it sounded like something much larger approaching. Sound distortion is one of the most powerful triggers of fear, and caves were natural amplifiers of dread. Anthropologists suspect that the origins of many ghostly or monstrous figures in human culture trace back to these distorted nighttime sounds. Dreams filled with voices, growls, and whispers likely stemmed from the cave's eerie soundscape, replayed by the brain as spectral encounters. Even temperature added to the misery. Caves are usually cold, damp, and stable at temperatures just above freezing. That might feel refreshing for a few minutes, but not when you're lying on wet grass and sharing body heat with half a dozen other smoke-drenched humans. Shivering through the night, waking with stiff joints, and feeling your skin numb from cold, all created sensations of suffocation and paralysis. Some nightmares may have been the body's attempt to explain why you could not move, a prehistoric version of the sleep paralysis people still experience today. And then there was the light. Firelight flickering against the walls created dancing shadows that looked like moving figures. The human eye is wired to recognize faces and forms even when none exist, a trait called pareidolia. Combine that with exhaustion, hunger, and smoke, and you get hallucinations of looming shapes crawling along the walls. These shadows, burned into the mind at the edge of sleep, became the content of nightmares. Early cave paintings of animals and abstract figures might not have been mere art. Some anthropologists argue they were attempts to capture the hallucinations of half-asleep minds staring into firelit stone. A combination of toxic smoke, cold drafts, dripping ceilings, distorted echoes and flickering shadows turned caves into sensory torture chambers. Nightmares were inevitable, and they were often communal. When one person cried out, the rest woke to the same terrifying environment, each layering their own fears onto the group. Over time, these shared terrors evolved into rituals meant to ward off spirits, but the spirits were just the cave itself, magnified by human imagination. Picture yourself trying to sleep there. You lie on damp bedding that smells of ash and mildew. Smoke scrapes at your throat. A drop of icy water splashes on your face. The firelight flares and throws a shadow across the wall that looks far too much like a figure leaning toward you. The cave echoes with a low rumble, though you cannot tell if it is the wind or something alive. Your chest tightens, your breath shortens, and your brain writes the script for another nightmare. You dream of being buried, of choking, of being watched by unseen eyes. You wake with a jolt, and nothing about your surroundings convinces you it was just a dream. Caves trained humans to expect terror in the dark, and that expectation carried forward long after we abandoned them. The idea of haunted houses, shadowy lairs, and monsters lurking underground is not a modern invention. It is a memory burned into our species from the nights we spent trapped in stone chambers that never allowed for true rest. And if the caves themselves were not enough, the food you ate before bed added a whole new layer of horror. Because when your diet consisted of half-cooked meat and fermenting plants, your stomach became another factory of nightmares. Your stomach was another enemy of sleep, and it rarely made things easy. Prehistoric diets were unpredictable, ranging from freshly hunted meat to whatever plants you could scavenge, with a healthy sprinkling of parasites hiding in both. There was no refrigeration, no spice cabinet to hide the taste of decay, and no guarantee that tonight's meal would not make a surprise return in the middle of the night. Archaeologists examining the remains of early humans have found evidence of chronic digestive issues, from parasites like roundworms to bacteria carried in undercooked meat. It turns out that a belly full of half-rotten mammoth was less a feast and more a one-way ticket to a nightmare-ridden night. Food poisoning in the Stone Age was not just a minor inconvenience. Without modern cooking methods, pathogens thrived. Salmonella, E. coli and tapeworms were uninvited dinner guests that regularly showed up at the table. A bloated stomach, cramps or fever at night often triggered the brain to process these sensations in dreams. Nightmares of suffocation, stabbing pain, or monsters crawling inside you may have been the mind's confused interpretation of very real infections tearing through the body. Anthropologists studying dream content have noted that nightmares often track physical sensations. In a world where parasites were more common than clean water, dreams of being consumed from the inside were likely a nightly occurrence. Fermentation added another twist. Prehistoric people discovered that leaving fruits or grains to rot sometimes produced alcohol. It was weak and unpredictable, but it packed enough punch to make people stumble, laugh, and collapse in a haze. Unfortunately, alcohol is notorious for disturbing sleep. Even a small amount interrupts REM cycles, the stage where dreams occur. Imagine drinking crude, half-fermented fruit mash before collapsing in a smoky cave. The combination of alcohol, smoke, and parasites practically guaranteed bizarre, vivid nightmares. If you have ever woken up from a hangover, with anxious dreams still clinging to you, you're experiencing the same neurological chaos that cavemen pioneered with their accidental brews. The diet also lacked balance. Protein-heavy meals of meat with almost no carbohydrates meant your body spent nights in metabolic strain. Low blood sugar can cause sweating, palpitations, and restlessness, all of which feed into bad dreams. Starvation nights were even worse. During famines, when food was scarce, people often went to bed hungry, and hunger has a powerful effect on sleep. Modern sleep studies show that hunger produces vivid dreams about food, often turning into nightmares about scarcity or being denied sustenance. For cavemen, whose survival hinged on hunting success, nightmares of missing a kill or starving to death were probably constant companions. There is also evidence that certain plants contributed directly to dream activity. Prehistoric people did not always know what was edible and what was toxic. Experiments with roots, leaves, and mushrooms often resulted in hallucinations, sickness, or death. Ethnobotanists suggest that some early groups may have ingested plants like nightshade or wild mushrooms, either by accident or in crude ritual. Many of these plants contain alkaloids that disrupt neurotransmitters, producing fever dreams and night terrors. In a cave setting, one person writhing in a toxic-induced nightmare could spread panic to the whole group. What began as one stomachache quickly escalated into shared visions of danger and spirits in the dark. Picture yourself now, lying on your damp grass bedding with your stomach twisting from whatever questionable meal you managed to choke down. It could have been slightly undercooked meat, its juices still harbouring parasites. It could have been a handful of bitter roots that left your tongue numb and your chest tight. Either way, your body is in revolt. Your stomach gurgles like a bubbling swamp, your throat burns, and sweat drips down your forehead as your mind collapses into uneasy dreams. In those dreams, the cramps become claws digging into your side. The heat of fever turns into visions of fire. The twitch of your gut becomes a monster gnawing on your insides. You wake gasping, but the nightmare lingers because the pain has not gone anywhere. This cycle reinforced itself. Food was unpredictable, digestion was brutal, and sleep was shallow. Nightmares were less a rare phenomenon and more a nightly guarantee. Archaeological evidence of early human parasites is staggering. Coprolites, fossilized feces, often contain worm eggs and parasite remains, showing that infestations were widespread. If your insides are alive with creatures, it is only natural that your dreams are filled with crawling horrors. What the modern world calls psychological anxiety may have had much more literal origins when you spent your nights fighting an internal zoo. Food storage only added to the problem. Leftovers were left to rot in the same caves where people slept. Bones, fat scraps, and half-chewed carcasses all attracted flies and rodents. The stench alone was enough to churn your stomach, but breathing in the spores of rotting meat also triggered illness. People sometimes tried to bury or burn excess food, but in lean times they often went back to chew on rancid scraps anyway. Dreams of decay, rot, and death may have been seeded by the nightly presence of decomposing food in the corner of your shelter. Despite the misery, food was central to survival, and so were the nightmares it inspired. They acted like twisted lessons. Dreams of starving reinforced the urgency of hunting. Nightmares of parasites or rot may have taught groups which foods to avoid. In this way, even the worst dreams had an evolutionary benefit. Your restless nights trained you to be cautious with what you ate, even if it meant spending your whole life haunted by visions of being devoured from the inside out. So as you lie there clutching your stomach caught between fever dreams and insect bites, you realize that your very diet was conspiring against your rest. Every bite came with risk, every meal had consequences, and the result was a mind hardwired for nightmares. The truth is that food was never just fuel. In the Stone Age, it was the starting point for dream worlds filled with terror, and your brain carried those habits forward into the present. And the nightmares did not stop with your food. The very act of sharing that food with others created an entirely new set of terrors. Because when meals happened around the fire, so did the stories, and those stories crept into dreams just as easily as parasites crept into your stomach. You might think that once the food was chewed and the fire was stoked, the worst part of the evening was over, but sitting around the flames, stomachs groaning and smoke hanging heavy in the cave, another force crept into the human mind that made nightmares even more vivid. Storytelling. The very thing that would one day create myths, religions, and bedtime stories began here, as small groups huddled together and tried to explain the noises, shadows, and fears of the night. Anthropologists believe the flickering firelight was more than warmth. It was the first theatre. Faces glowed orange, shadows stretched across the walls, and words began to shape the unseen into something recognizable. Stories were not entertainment in the modern sense. They were warnings, lessons, and explanations for the inexplicable. If a hunter had seen a lion lurking beyond the fire the night before, he described it in such a way that everyone now feared the darkness even more. The echo of those words stayed in the brain as people drifted to sleep, feeding the raw material for their dreams. Oral traditions may be tens of thousands of years old, far older than writing. Myths about spirits and monsters likely trace back to these earliest conversations. Scientists studying dream patterns note that our brains often incorporate recent conversations into dream imagery. That means the tale you just heard about a giant snake in the forest quickly turned into the nightmare of being strangled in your sleep. Around the fire, fears were shared, magnified, and retold until they took on lives of their own. Nightmares were not only personal, they were collective hallucinations born from spoken words. The shadows of the cave walls helped too. Firelight dances unpredictably, making shapes look alive. This trick of the eye is called pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces or figures where none exist. In prehistoric settings, pareidolia was constant. A jagged crack in the wall might look like a monster's mouth. A shadow might resemble a clawed hand. Once someone pointed it out, the entire group saw it, and soon the story of the clawed shadow became part of the night's lore. When sleep finally came, the mind replayed these images in dreams, making them sharper and more terrifying. The oldest cave art may have been an extension of this process. Paleolithic paintings often depict animals, human-like figures, or abstract signs. Archaeologists debate their purpose, but one theory is that they were meant to capture visions seen in dreams or hallucinations. In this sense, cave walls were not just art galleries. They were dream journals etched in ochre and charcoal. Nightmares of stampeding animals or predatory cats could be replayed by painting them, embedding the terror into the group's memory and giving it permanence. There is also evidence that storytelling rituals may have included rhythmic sounds. Early humans likely used clapping, chanting, or primitive instruments like bone flutes. Music alters brain waves, and repetitive rhythms can induce trance-like states. Combined with fatigue and smoke inhalation, these sounds may have pushed people into dreamlike conditions before they even lay down to sleep. Nightmares of drums, echoes, or voices may have been literal echoes of evening rituals still bouncing in the skull. Some neuroscientists argue that our brain's natural connection between rhythm and trance has roots in this prehistoric sleep prep routine. Think about what this meant for your night. You sit by the fire listening to someone describe the spirit of a hyena that laughs when a person is about to die. The shadows leap across the cave wall and look suspiciously like laughing faces. Someone nearby begins a low chant, adding weight to the story. Your eyes grow heavy, your stomach still twisting from rancid food, and soon you are sliding into sleep. When the nightmare comes, it is a perfect storm. The hyena spirit you just heard about paces in your dreams, its laughter echoing through the chamber. The shadows form claws that reach for you. The chanting turns into whispers at your ear. You wake in a panic, only to find the echoes are real. The power of these fireside stories went beyond nightmares. They created the foundations of culture. Fear of the dark, belief in spirits, and rituals to ward off unseen forces all grew out of these nightly gatherings. Anthropologists argue that collective storytelling may have been one of the earliest survival tools. If everyone in the group feared the same predator or spirit, they acted together. Nightmares then reinforced these fears, making them even harder to forget. Your dreams trained you to take the story seriously. In this way, fear was not just an emotion, it was a binding glue that held groups together. But fear also spread misinformation. Not every story was accurate. One person's nightmare of a giant bird could become a group belief, leading everyone to fear shadows overhead that were nothing more than bats. Dreams blurred with reality, and storytelling magnified the confusion. This may be how superstition began, and superstition became part of daily life. The difference between a real predator and an imagined one was not always clear when both prowled your sleep. Now put yourself fully into that scene. The fire pops, sparks leap, smoke curls into your lungs, and voices tell tales of monsters just beyond the circle of light. You curl on the bedding, trying to shut it out, but your brain refuses. It replays the tales, mixes them with shadows, adds the twist of hunger or fever, and delivers a nightmare so vivid you wake choking on fear. The next morning, the story spreads again, now amplified by your dream. The line between memory and nightmare fades, and once again, the fire becomes a forge of shared terrors. This cycle never stopped. Even today, we tell scary stories before bed, from ghost tales at campfires to horror movies on screens. The roots of that tradition go back to these prehistoric firesides, where storytelling did not ease you into sleep but shoved you head first into a nightmare. And if the stories were not enough to keep your brain restless, the insects crawling across your skin throughout the night certainly finished the job. Because even while dreams conjured shadowy monsters, the real ones were already feeding on you. And while the stories echoed in your head long after the fire dimmed, something else ensured your sleep was never peaceful: the insects. Night after night, your bedding, your hair, and even your skin itself became the feeding ground for countless parasites. Archaeological studies of ancient human remains have uncovered lice eggs cemented to strands of fossilized hair, flea fossils preserved in caves, and even preserved excrement teeming with evidence of intestinal worms. Cavemen did not just imagine crawling horrors in their nightmares. They lived with them, and their bodies provided an all-you-can-eat buffet. Head lice were almost universal. Without combs or soap, populations were crawling with them. They nested in hair, laid eggs near the scalp, and spread rapidly through close contact in communal bedding. Sleeping in groups meant sharing body heat, but it also meant sharing lice colonies. The constant itching, the sensation of things crawling on the scalp, and the skin infections caused by scratching would have made sleep shallow and disturbed. Dreams of bugs swarming over the body were not metaphorical. They were nightly reality. Fleas were even worse. They thrived in the grass bedding layered with ash, finding warmth and food in the very places people thought were safe. Fossilized flea species dating back tens of thousands of years show that they were already specialized for sucking blood from mammals like humans. A single female flea can lay dozens of eggs at a time, which meant infestations multiplied quickly. Imagine lying down after a long day, trying to rest on your patch of grass and fur, only to feel dozens of bites flaring across your skin. The itching never stopped, and the welts became infected. The body's response to these bites often included fever, swelling, and in some cases allergic shock. Dreams filled with sensations of biting and gnawing were often triggered by these physical symptoms. Then came bedbugs, those infamous sleep saboteurs. While the earliest fossil evidence for bedbugs dates back millions of years, genetic studies suggest they were already plaguing humans in the Paleolithic. Bedbugs crawl out at night, drawn to the heat and carbon dioxide of sleeping bodies. They feed silently, leaving itchy welts, and sometimes causing anemia in heavily infested populations. Unlike lice or fleas, they were stealthier, making their attacks harder to notice until the damage was done. Waking up covered in itchy lines of bites may have fed directly into nightmares of being hunted, drained, or consumed by unseen predators. Parasites were not limited to the skin. Worms and intestinal parasites were rampant. Coprolite analysis, studies of ancient feces, regularly reveals evidence of roundworms, whipworms, and tapeworms. These creatures caused abdominal pain, diarrhea, and malnutrition, all of which influenced sleep. A twisting gut, constant bloating, or unexplained weight loss would easily manifest in dreams as visions of monsters devouring the body from within. Some researchers believe that recurring nightmares of snakes or worms can be traced back to the bodily experience of parasitic infection. Your subconscious did not have to invent inner demons. They were already there, feeding in the intestines. Mosquitoes were another nightly torment. In regions where they thrived, buzzing clouds swarmed caves and shelters. Their bites not only itched, but also carried diseases like malaria, which has infected humans for tens of thousands of years. Malaria causes cycles of fever, chills, and delirium. A caveman racked with malaria symptoms would have experienced terrifying fever dreams, often hallucinations indistinguishable from nightmares. The mosquito's high-pitched drone circling your ears in the dark became a soundtrack for restless sleep and visions of winged tormentors. All of this combined into an environment where sleep itself was never neutral. Your skin burned from constant itching, your stomach churned from parasites, and your ears buzzed with the sound of insects feeding. Dreams of suffocating swarms, of being drained by unseen mouths, or of crawling infestations were so common that they likely became part of the earliest oral traditions. Groups would warn each other of evil spirits that creep in the night, but the reality was much more literal. Those spirits were fleas, lice, and worms, faithfully haunting every human body. Modern science gives us more perspective. Researchers studying the psychology of dreams note that tactile sensations during sleep often carry directly into dream imagery. That means the feeling of a flea bite, the tickle of a louse crawling, or the buzz of a mosquito can be interpreted as being attacked by monsters, spirits, or animals in nightmares. What cavemen experienced as demonic visions were simply their brains trying to interpret the endless onslaught of crawling, biting, and buzzing. In many ways, nightmares were just the mind's confused attempt at pest control. Try to picture yourself lying there. Your head itches so badly you want to tear out your hair. Your bedding twitches with unseen movement. Every time you close your eyes, another bite flares on your skin. Your stomach cramps as worms twist inside. You fall asleep, but the itching follows you into your dreams. You see yourself covered in swarming creatures, your body consumed, your breath stolen by thousands of tiny jaws. You wake gasping, scratching at your arms, only to realize that reality is no better. The insects are still there. This nightly torture left deep marks on the human psyche. Even today, phobias of insects, spiders, and crawling things are some of the most common fears worldwide. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that these fears were forged in the Stone Age, when bugs were not just nuisances but health hazards. A single mosquito bite could spread disease. A worm infection could kill slowly over months. Nightmares reinforced the need to stay vigilant, teaching humans to fear the tiny predators that drained them night after night. But insects were not the only thing attacking you in the dark. The weather itself became another nightmare factory. Because when the storms rolled in, the cave that sheltered you from predators turned into a theatre of thunder, lightning and floods that the human brain struggled to comprehend. The storm outside was as much a threat as the predators and parasites inside. Thunder rolled through valleys, lightning split the sky, and the cave itself shook like a drum. For humans without science, these sounds were not just weather. They were living forces. Every flash of lightning carved shadows across the cave walls, and every crash of thunder rattled bones and made the heart pound. To a brain primed for danger, these storms became monsters. The earliest nightmares of roaring gods or angry spirits were likely born from the sound of thunder rumbling through the night. Archaeologists studying prehistoric climate know that early humans lived through violent swings in weather. The Pleistocene epoch, the period covering much of the Stone Age, was marked by repeated ice ages, sudden warming, and brutal storms. Winds could tear through shelters, rain could flood caves, and sudden freezes could kill entire groups. Even fire, the great protector, often sputtered out in the face of wind and rain. When fire went dark, nightmares were inevitable. The night became absolute, the cave filled with cold, and the mind conjured visions of freezing, drowning, or being swept away. Lightning itself left a lasting mark. Anthropologists suggest that myths of gods hurling fire from the sky, or demons striking in the night, trace back to humanity's earliest encounters with lightning storms. Imagine lying on damp bedding, smoke in your lungs, and watching the mouth of your cave explode in blinding flashes. The sound echoes into your chest like a beating drum. Your mind translates it into an attack, a punishment, or a beast roaring above. When you finally fall asleep, your brain replays it as a nightmare of fire from the sky. The dream lingers because the storm outside never stops reminding you. Floods were worse. Many caves used for shelter show evidence of water damage, proving that they were often inundated by storms. Bedding layered with grass and ash would turn into a swamp overnight. Pools of stagnant water collected in corners, breeding more insects and mould. Waking up wet, cold, and coughing was common. The sensation of drowning or suffocating, common themes in nightmares, may have roots in these storm-soaked nights. You closed your eyes to dream of gasping for breath, only to wake with your bedding soaked and your lungs filled with damp air. Cold snaps added their own horrors. During the Ice Ages, temperatures could plummet without warning. Archaeological evidence shows that groups often clustered deeper into caves for warmth, which only trapped more smoke and made breathing harder. Hypothermia set in quickly, and the body's response, shivering, confusion, and hallucinations, fed directly into dream content. People dreamt of freezing, of being unable to move, of shadows swallowing them whole. Some never woke, their frozen bodies preserved by the same caves that had once promised safety. Nightmares of freezing alive were not metaphors. They were lived realities replayed in the minds of survivors. Wind played tricks too. Caves acted like giant instruments, amplifying gusts into howls. Archaeologists studying cave acoustics have found that some chambers produce eerie tones when air passes through narrow openings. These natural whistles and roars would have sounded like voices or spirits in the dark. Sleeping to the sound of a cave moaning was not conducive to peace. Dreams of whispering figures or ghostly cries likely originated from the cave itself, reshaped by the storm outside. Your mind filled in the blanks, inventing spirits to explain the sounds, then replaying them in nightmares that felt too real to dismiss. The psychological effect of storms was magnified by timing. Humans tend to sleep at night, when predators are active and storms are most frightening. Lightning at midday was alarming, but lightning in the dead of night was terror. Without control over the environment, people projected agency onto the weather. Storms were not just random, they were punishments, warnings, or signs of danger. Dreams reinforced this belief, creating visions of gods, spirits, or monstrous forces behind the thunder. These became some of humanity's earliest myths, carried forward into every culture that followed. Now place yourself back in that cave. The fire sputters as rain pours at the entrance. Wind shrieks through cracks, making the walls groan. The ground beneath your bedding is slick with water. Lightning blinds you for a second, painting jagged shadows across the stone. Your chest rattles with each clap of thunder. You pull the damp hide tighter, but the cold still seeps into your bones. When sleep comes, it is not gentle. You dream of drowning, of skies splitting open, of being chased by fire and water at once. You jolt awake, heart racing, but the storm continues, and you realize the nightmare is only mirroring reality. The constant assault of weather shaped human fears for millennia. Storms trained us to see power in the skies, to fear the night, and to dream of forces larger than ourselves. Even today, dreams of falling, drowning, or being chased by unseen powers echo the same sensations that prehistoric storms carved into the human nervous system. Nightmares were not random. They were nightly rehearsals written by wind, rain, and lightning. And just when storms and predators seemed like enough, the human brain found new ways to torment itself. The very cycles of sleep, fragile and broken in the Stone Age, created a perfect breeding ground for night terrors. Because long before memory foam or blackout curtains, sleep itself was divided, restless, and deeply unnatural. Sleep itself was never whole in the Stone Age. It came in fragments, scattered across the night like sparks from the fire. Anthropologists studying traditional societies that still live without electricity have observed that uninterrupted 8-hour sleep is a modern invention. Prehistoric people likely practiced segmented sleep, slipping into shallow rest for a few hours, waking to tend the fire or check for danger, then collapsing back into another stretch. This constant interruption made dreams shorter, stranger, and more vivid. Your body never reached the deep restorative stages we rely on now, so the brain spun wild fragments into nightmares that ended as abruptly as they began. Historical records from as late as the Middle Ages show that segmented sleep survived for millennia. People referred to first sleep and second sleep as normal phases of the night. In prehistoric caves, the pattern was less choice and more necessity. Fires burned down quickly, predators circled, and smoke choked sleepers awake. Waking in the middle of the night was not insomnia. It was routine. And each time you drifted back down, your mind picked up fragments of fear, weaving them into dreams that made no sense yet felt urgently threatening. Modern neuroscientists studying sleep deprivation have found that fragmented sleep increases the frequency of nightmares. When the brain cannot settle into steady cycles, it lurches into REM sleep, the stage of vivid dreaming, more chaotically. This means prehistoric nights were peppered with REM bursts, each one a fresh nightmare. Instead of one long dream, your brain gave you multiple episodes of horror across the night. Picture waking up coughing from smoke, then falling back into a dream where you're choking on water, then waking again to a growl outside, and then dreaming of being chased by unseen figures. Each interruption only fed the next cycle of terror. Light also played a role. Without controlled environments, prehistoric people slept and woke with the natural rise and fall of fire and moonlight. Studies of circadian rhythms suggest that moon phases affected sleep patterns in ancient populations. Bright full moons disrupted rest, keeping people half awake and half dreaming. Nightmares of glowing eyes or pale figures in the dark may have been seeded by nothing more than moonlight streaming into the cave. The brain, caught between sleep and wakefulness, turned faint light into monstrous shapes. Add hunger and illness into the mix, and segmented sleep became unbearable. People often woke up because their stomachs were growling or their guts were twisting with parasites. Fever broke rest into smaller and smaller pieces. Each time you woke, drenched in sweat or shivering in cold, you carried the sensation back into your next dream. Researchers today find that fever dreams are unusually vivid and disturbing, often involving fire, suffocation, or being attacked. Cavemen likely lived with these nightly episodes regularly, their dreams warped by the endless cycle of waking and collapsing again. What is fascinating is that this broken pattern of rest may have hardwired humans to expect fear in the dark. Anthropologists note that many traditional societies use the period between first and second sleep for storytelling, ritual, or even socializing. In prehistory, that wakeful stretch in the middle of the night may have been filled with whispered warnings and tales around the fire. Imagine lying awake, listening to someone describe the spirit of a predator that lurks at midnight, then finally drifting off again. Your brain carries the story directly into your nightmare, magnifying it with the fresh jolt of fear still in your chest. Even the position of sleep mattered. Huddled groups often slept sitting upright or half curled around the fire to stay warm and alert. This posture made breathing harder and increased the risk of sleep apnea-like interruptions. Sleep studies show that poor posture at night increases microarousals, where the brain wakes briefly without full consciousness. For cavemen, this constant flickering between wake and sleep would have created dream states indistinguishable from reality. Nightmares of being unable to move, of pressure on the chest, or of being pinned down all align with modern sleep paralysis. It is possible that the terrifying visions people experience in paralysis today are echoes of the same sensations that plagued prehistoric sleepers in smoky caves. The consequences of this fractured rest were not just psychological. Chronic poor sleep weakens the immune system, increases irritability, and reduces coordination. Groups living on the edge of survival were pushed even further to the brink by their lack of real rest. Every morning began with aching joints, foggy minds, and tempers short from a night of constant disturbance. Nightmares may have served as warnings, but they also meant that nobody ever truly recharged. Sleep was less recovery and more survival exercise, leaving the human species perpetually tired and perpetually anxious. Now place yourself back in that cave. You fall asleep for an hour, coughing on smoke, then wake to feed the fire. You collapse again for another hour, only to stir when someone shifts beside you. Your stomach cramps and wakes you. You drift again and dream of being strangled. Another burst of wind blows sparks across your bedding, waking you once more. By dawn you have slept 8 hours in name only, broken into jagged fragments that left your body exhausted and your mind filled with visions of horror. You step into the morning not rested, but carrying the weight of a dozen small nightmares that feel as real as memories. This cycle trained humanity to live in fear of the dark and mistrustful of sleep itself. Even today, insomnia, restlessness, and waking in the middle of the night persist in modern populations despite the absence of predators and smoky caves. Our biology was carved by thousands of years of fragmented nights, and nightmares were its natural byproduct. And as if broken sleep was not enough, another factor twisted prehistoric dreams into terrors. The dead themselves became part of the night. When caves doubled as shelters and burial sites, humans found themselves sleeping beside corpses, and nothing fuels nightmares quite like sharing your bed with the remains of the past. The cave was not only your bedroom, it was your graveyard too. Archaeologists have uncovered countless burials inside the same caves where people lived, hunted, and tried to sleep. Neanderthal remains found at sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq show deliberate burials dating back over 60,000 years. That means early humans were not only sheltering inside these stone chambers, but also laying their dead to rest there. The boundary between life and death was thin, and when you curled up on your bedding, there was a very real chance that a corpse was lying only a few feet away. It is easy to see how this shaped nightmares. The smell alone was inescapable. Even a shallow burial under stones or dirt leaked its scent into the air. Decomposition is a process as old as life itself, and caves trap the stench in their damp chambers. Imagine drifting to sleep in smoke and mildew, only to be jolted awake by the sweet, cloying odour of decay. Your mind filled in the gaps. The shadows on the walls became the dead rising. The creaks of stone became footsteps of those buried nearby. Your nightmares were not of abstract demons. They were of the people you had once known, now silent companions in the dark. Anthropologists debate why prehistoric humans buried their dead in caves. Some believe it was convenience. Caves offered ready-made protection from scavengers. Others suggest it reflected early spiritual beliefs, an attempt to place the dead closer to the group or to prepare them for some imagined afterlife. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Sleep and death became neighbours, and the psychological toll was enormous. Nightmares of corpses moving, whispering, or reaching for the living were likely common in cultures where the dead were part of daily life. There is even evidence of symbolic burials. At Shanidar, pollen traces suggest flowers may have been placed with the dead, a ritual thousands of years older than written history. That means death was not only present but commemorated. The cave itself became a sacred space, part tomb and part bedroom. In the flickering firelight, flowers and bones side by side blurred into dream images of beauty and horror intertwined. Your nightmares could have been painted in petals and skulls all at once. Sleeping beside the dead also carried health risks. Corpses attract scavengers and insects. Flies, beetles, and rodents would have been drawn to the remains, bringing disease into living spaces. Early humans had no knowledge of bacteria or contagion, but they knew instinctively that proximity to the dead meant danger. Nightmares of suffocation or illness may have been the brain's way of warning against contamination. Even if you could not explain it, your subconscious supplied nightly reminders that lying beside the dead was not safe. And then there were the bones themselves. Archaeological sites reveal that some bones were deliberately arranged, painted, or even reused. Skulls were sometimes kept, perhaps as relics or objects of reverence. Imagine waking in the middle of the night, eyes adjusting to the firelight, only to see the hollow sockets of a skull staring back at you from the shadows. That image alone would haunt your dreams. The earliest nightmares of ghosts or spirits may not have come from imagination at all. They may have been inspired by actual skulls set within the sleeping chamber. The psychological effect of all this cannot be overstated. Humans are hardwired to fear death, yet in the Stone Age, death was everywhere. Mortality rates were brutal. Child burials have been uncovered alongside adults, showing that families often slept where they mourned. The grief, the scent of decay, and the sight of bones all blended into the dream world. Nightmares became grief given form, repeating the faces of the dead long after they were gone. Try to imagine lying there now. The smoke curls around your face. The damp bedding clings to your skin. A body lies beneath a shallow layer of stones only a few steps away. The fire crackles and casts flickering light over the outline of a skull in the corner. You shut your eyes but cannot silence the thought that the dead are watching. Sleep finally drags you down, and your dreams deliver what you already expect. You see the dead rising, reaching, whispering. You wake in panic, but the smell reminds you it is not just fantasy. You're sharing your bedroom with corpses. This practice shaped human culture for millennia. Burial inside caves created traditions of ancestor worship, rituals, and eventually myths of spirits that linger among the living. Nightmares gave these ideas staying power. Dreams replayed the presence of the dead until they felt undeniably real. Even now, modern cultures retain echoes of this prehistoric habit. Haunted houses, ghost stories, and horror films all trade on the same imagery: the fear of sleeping beside the dead and waking to find them restless. But corpses were not the only thing haunting prehistoric nights. The living were sometimes just as dangerous. Competition within groups, violence over resources, and the ever-present threat of conflict meant that nightmares were fueled not only by predators and storms, but also by the people lying next to you. The dead were unsettling, but the living were often worse. Sleeping in a cave with your group meant lying down beside the same people who might steal your food, challenge your place, or try to kill you in the morning. Archaeological evidence shows that interpersonal violence was common in prehistory. Skulls with blunt force trauma, skeletons with spear points still lodged in ribs, and fractured bones all point to conflict as a routine part of existence. When you closed your eyes at night, it was not just predators or spirits lurking in your mind. It was the uneasy awareness that the person lying beside you had once considered caving in your skull a viable option. This was not paranoia. Violence in early human groups was tied to survival. Resources were scarce, and disputes over food, mates, or territory erupted often. Some anthropologists suggest that up to 15% of deaths in prehistoric populations were caused by violence, a rate far higher than in modern societies. That meant fear of attack was ever present, even within your own group. Nightmares of betrayal, ambush, or sudden blows to the head likely mirrored the lived reality of waking up to a fight. Your brain rehearsed conflict the same way it rehearsed predator attacks, embedding aggression and suspicion deep into the dream world. Weapons were crude but effective. Stone tools doubled as hunting gear and killing instruments. Archaeological digs have uncovered obsidian blades sharpened to surgical precision, capable of slicing flesh cleanly. Spears with flint tips carried the same lethality in close quarters as they did on the hunt. In caves where firelight flickered and tempers flared, these tools transformed into symbols of fear. Nightmares of sharp points glinting in the dark or being struck down by unseen blows were not wild fantasies. They were reflections of real dangers. Competition for dominance made sleep uneasy too. Studies of primates, especially chimpanzees, show that social hierarchies are enforced with violence. Early humans likely lived under similar dynamics. The alpha male or dominant figure had privileges, and challenges often ended in bloody clashes. The losers carried wounds that ached through the night, their pain feeding into dream imagery of punishment and humiliation. Nightmares of being chased, beaten, or cast out may have originated in these struggles for power, shaping the way the human brain processes social anxiety even today. Anthropologists studying trauma have found that violent experiences often replay in dreams. Survivors of attacks dream of them again and again, sometimes for years. In prehistoric groups, where violence was routine, entire communities may have carried shared dreamscapes filled with blood and fear. A group traumatized by losing a member in a fight would carry that memory into the night, replaying it collectively in dreams and retellings. Nightmares were not isolated. They were contagious, spreading through groups like whispers of future danger. The fire in the cave did little to ease the tension. Its light cast shadows that twisted into weapons on the walls. Its warmth did not stop the memory of the last fight, when blood stained the same floor where you now tried to sleep. Your brain, primed for survival, translated this tension into dreams of betrayal. Perhaps you dreamt of being cornered, of friends turning to enemies, or of hands reaching to strangle you in the dark. You woke with your heart pounding, glanced around the cave and found the very people from your nightmare sleeping only inches away. Even burial sites reflect this violence. Some bodies found in caves bear evidence of execution-style wounds, blows delivered with no chance of defense. Others show patterns of injuries that healed, proving that survivors carried scars for life. These wounds would have hurt most at night, when stillness let pain radiate through the body. Dreams of being struck again were not psychological quirks. They were the mind's way of making sense of throbbing bones and aching muscles. Your nightmares replayed the violence until it became as real as waking memory. This constant threat warped the meaning of trust. To survive, groups needed to cooperate, but cooperation was always undercut by suspicion. Nightmares became tools of reinforcement, reminding individuals of the dangers of betrayal. The dream of being attacked kept you vigilant, even toward those closest to you. In this way, nightmares about violence may have actually strengthened group cohesion, ensuring that no one ever forgot the consequences of stepping out of line. Fear was the glue that kept the group together, even as it haunted every night's sleep. Now put yourself in that position. You're lying on damp grass, smoke in your lungs, and the faint ache of a bruise on your ribs where someone shoved you earlier in the day. The firelight flickers, glinting off the edge of a stone blade propped against the wall. You try to close your eyes, but your mind replays the fight. In your dream, the shove becomes a strike, the glint of the blade becomes a stab, and the shouting voices grow louder until you jolt awake, gasping. You glance around and see the same faces, sleeping soundly, as if they were not the executioners in your nightmare. The cycle of fear and violence shaped the human psyche deeply. Even in modern dreams, themes of betrayal, pursuit, and violence remain common. Psychologists see these as echoes of ancestral anxieties, the same ones that played out in smoky caves filled with both family and rivals. Nightmares preserved lessons about danger, reminding the brain to stay alert even among supposed allies. And violence was not only a human problem. Encounters with other species, including Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, introduced conflict on a much larger scale. Groups that met in contested territories sometimes fought, leaving behind archaeological traces of massacres and raids. Nightmares of strangers, the foreign faces in the dark, may have roots in these clashes, shaping humanity's enduring fear of the unknown. Violence was not the only factor that turned sleep into torment. The very biology of the brain, shaped by fear, smoke, and exhaustion, played its own tricks. Night terrors, hallucinations, and sleep paralysis began long before modern medicine gave them names, and in the Stone Age they were interpreted as spirits pressing on the chest, or demons entering the body. Your body betrayed you in the night just as much as predators or parasites. Long before doctors gave names like sleep paralysis or night terrors, prehistoric people endured them without explanation, and the only conclusion was that something supernatural was happening. Imagine lying on your back trying to breathe through the smoky air when suddenly you find yourself awake but unable to move. Your eyes are open, your lungs ache, and a crushing weight presses down on your chest. In modern medicine, this is sleep paralysis. In the Stone Age, it was a spirit pinning you to the floor. Studies today show that around 8% of people regularly experience sleep paralysis, and the number climbs much higher in populations under stress or sleep deprivation. Both were constants in the Stone Age. Broken sleep cycles, malnutrition, smoke inhalation, and constant danger all raise the odds of paralysis episodes. When the body slips into REM sleep, muscles go limp to prevent acting out dreams. But sometimes the brain wakes while the body is still paralyzed, leaving you trapped in a half-dream state. The hallucinations that follow are shaped by fear, and in a cave full of shadows and whispers, the visions turned into monsters. Anthropologists have traced the cultural echoes of this phenomenon across the world. In medieval Europe, people called it the night hag, an old woman sitting on your chest. In Japan, it became kanashibari, meaning to be bound by metal. In Newfoundland, it was the old hag, and in parts of Africa, spirits were blamed. The universality of these stories suggests that sleep paralysis has haunted humanity for tens of thousands of years, long before writing recorded it. For prehistoric people, the explanation was obvious. Something in the cave, unseen, was suffocating them in their sleep. The hallucinations of sleep paralysis often involve shadowy figures, glowing eyes, or sensations of being watched. These fit perfectly with the Stone Age environment. Firelight already created flickering shadows, predators already lurked outside, corpses already lay nearby. The mind simply merged these fears into one crushing vision. Dreams of suffocation, of being pressed into the ground, of spirits leaning close and whispering were born from a real neurological glitch, one magnified by exhaustion and fear. Night terrors added another layer. Unlike nightmares, which occur in REM sleep, night terrors erupt during deep sleep. The body thrashes, the heart races, and the sleeper often screams without waking. Children are especially prone to them, and since prehistoric groups were filled with children, the sound of screaming in the night would have been common. Imagine a small group huddled in a cave, only for one child to suddenly bolt upright, shrieking with wide eyes while still asleep. The effect on the group would have been electric. Fear spread instantly, as others imagined the scream was a warning of danger lurking nearby. Night terrors did not just affect the dreamer, they infected the entire camp. Modern studies suggest night terrors are linked to stress, irregular sleep, and fever. All three were abundant in the Stone Age. With constant threats and poor health, it is likely that night terrors were nightly events in some groups. Over time, the screams in the dark may have fed myths of possession or haunting. The image of someone writhing and shouting in their sleep, eyes wide but mind absent, must have seemed like proof that spirits entered the body at night. Nightmares were bad enough. Night terrors turned caves into theatres of panic. Hallucinations outside of sleep added to the chaos. Starvation, dehydration, and illness often caused delirium. Archaeological evidence shows that some early humans consumed plants with psychoactive properties, intentionally or by accident. Mushrooms, roots, and berries could induce visions, especially when combined with exhaustion. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, creating nights where entire groups slipped into shared hallucinations. Your nightmare of spirits was reinforced by the man next to you swearing he saw the same thing. Shared fear became shared myth, and hallucinations spread like campfire stories, retold until they hardened into cultural truths. Picture yourself caught in one of these episodes. You wake, but you cannot move. Your lungs feel crushed, your chest pinned down. A shadow leans over you, whispering in a voice you cannot understand. You struggle to scream, but no sound comes out. The fire crackles, casting monstrous shapes across the wall. Finally, you jolt awake fully, gasping, but the shadow lingers in your mind. Around you, another sleeper thrashes and screams in a night terror. The entire group stirs in panic, convinced something unseen stalks the cave. You try to calm yourself, but your body trembles, and the dream refuses to fade. This cycle carved deep grooves into the human imagination. Nightmares of paralysis, suffocation, and shadows became universal themes across cultures. Even now, in the safety of the modern bedrooms, people wake with the sensation of weight on their chest, convinced something is there. The root of that fear reaches back to smoky caves, where exhausted bodies slipped into paralysis, and terrified brains invented spirits to explain it. The lesson of these episodes was simple but brutal. Sleep was never safe. Closing your eyes meant losing control of your body, and opening your mind to terrors that felt as real as waking life. Nightmares did not just haunt dreams, they blurred into reality, reinforcing the idea that night was a realm of spirits and monsters. And if sleep paralysis and night terrors were not enough, another factor shaped the earliest nightmares. The mind itself, still evolving, was learning how to process memory and fear. Dreams became the workshop of survival, and nightmares were the training drills. But memory in the Stone Age was fragile, scattered, and often warped. The result was a dream world where nothing was certain, and the past haunted the present every night. Your brain was still learning how to remember. Long before writing or calendars, memory existed only as fragile echoes carried in the mind, replayed in fragments each night. Neuroscientists today know that dreams are the brain's way of processing memory, filing away important lessons and discarding useless details. But in the Stone Age, memory was not a neat archive. It was a pile of sensory fragments, growls, screams, shadows, the sting of an insect bite, shuffled into chaotic images after dark. This meant your dreams were less about rest and more about reruns of the worst parts of your day. Evidence from modern hunter-gatherer societies shows that survival pressures hardwire memory toward negative events. If you nearly fall off a cliff, your brain stores that moment in high definition, because remembering it might save you next time. The same principle worked for prehistoric humans. Nightmares became exaggerated rehearsals of traumatic events, ensuring that the memory stuck. If you were chased by a predator, the dream replayed it with sharper claws and faster legs. If you went hungry, the dream showed you starving. The worse the vision, the stronger the lesson. Nightmares were educational tools disguised as torture. Archaeologists studying trauma in fossilized bones have found evidence of repeated injuries that healed over time. Broken arms, cracked ribs, and skull fractures tell the story of lives filled with danger. The pain of these injuries never vanished. At night, the body reminded the brain of its vulnerability. A throbbing rib became a dream of being crushed. A scarred skull became a nightmare of being struck again. Modern trauma studies confirm this pattern. Survivors of accidents and violence often dream of the event again and again. The same must have been true for Stone Age humans. Memory was fragile, but trauma carved grooves too deep to forget. Without writing, stories and dreams were the only way to preserve memory. Anthropologists suggest that nightmares helped carry cultural warnings forward. If someone dreamt of being mauled near a river, the group might avoid that river. Over time, these dream-inspired lessons became part of oral tradition. Memory was stored communally, with nightmares acting as nightly reminders of real dangers. It was not superstition, it was primitive risk management. But memory was not perfect. The human brain often confuses dreams with reality, especially when fear is involved. Experiments show that people who dream about an event sometimes recall it later, as if it truly happened. In the Stone Age, this confusion blurred the line between memory and nightmare. A dream of being chased by predators could be retold as a real encounter. A nightmare of starvation might be remembered as an actual near-death experience. Over generations, these misremembered nightmares shaped myths and group identity. Spirits, monsters, and curses may have started as nothing more than bad dreams, mistaken for real events. The hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for memory, was just as active then as it is now, but prehistoric lifestyles overloaded it. Constant hunger, fear, and exhaustion disrupted how memories were stored. Nightmares were the overflow, the brain's attempt to sort chaos into meaning. But the result was often terrifying. Dreams mixed together predators, storms, hunger, and death into stories that felt realer than reality. Waking in the morning, you carried fragments of nightmares as if they were lived experiences. This constant merging of memory and dream created a culture steeped in fear of the night. Picture yourself lying down after a brutal day. You nearly slipped from a cliff while gathering berries. You barely escaped a predator at dusk. Your stomach aches from hunger. These moments lodge in your mind, replayed in sleep with even sharper terror. You dream of falling endlessly, of claws dragging you back, of starvation turning into death. You jolt awake, heart racing, convinced it all happened again. You glance around the cave and realize nothing has changed. The dangers are still there, waiting for tomorrow. This fragile system of memory also explains why nightmares lingered so strongly. Negative experiences are stickier in memory because they aid survival. Positive dreams fade quickly, but terrifying ones persist. Modern dream studies show that people recall bad dreams more vividly than good ones. For cavemen, this bias ensured that fear dominated culture. Nightmares were not accidents. They were survival strategies etched into the brain, ensuring no one forgot the dangers of the world. Over time, these memories shaped ritual. Groups developed practices to ward off bad dreams, from charms to chants, believing that nightmares were visitations from spirits. In reality, they were the nervous system replaying trauma. But the rituals worked in their own way. They gave comfort, reduced anxiety, and made it easier to fall back asleep. Even placebo effects have evolutionary benefits. If a chant helped you sleep, you were more likely to survive another day. The irony is that memory is not precise. Dreams distorted events, making predators larger, storms louder, and hunger deadlier. The brain preferred exaggeration because exaggeration meant preparation. Better to dream of a lion with glowing eyes and impossible speed than to underestimate a real lion. Better to imagine drowning in endless floods than to forget the last time a storm nearly swept your group away. Nightmares rewrote memory into hyper-reality, and those rewrites became the stories told around the fire. And as memory faltered, imagination filled the gaps. Shadows became spirits, echoes became voices, nightmares turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. This was how myth was born. Memory and dream fused, and the result was a collective vision of a world filled with powers, dangers, and unseen forces. But memory was not the only thing twisting sleep. The body itself added its own terrors. Fevers, infections, and the constant struggle with illness created nights filled with delirium, sweats, and visions. If trauma replayed itself as nightmares, sickness invented new ones entirely, filling the dark with horrors no predator could match. Nightmares were not simply dreams gone sour. They were the uninvited offspring of biology, memory, and the harsh reality of living in a world where nearly everything wanted to kill you. When modern neuroscientists study sleep, they find that REM cycles allow the brain to replay, reprocess, and store information, usually twisting it into narratives that blend fragments of the day. For early humans, those fragments were rarely peaceful. Instead of work deadlines or awkward conversations, they had to file away the memory of being stalked by predators, struck by illness, or watching another member of their group fails to wake up. That constant input of raw terror created the perfect conditions for the invention of nightmares. One theory suggests that nightmares were survival rehearsals. Psychologists call this the threat simulation theory. The idea is that by replaying danger in your dreams, you practiced how to respond. It was essentially the brain's version of a prehistoric flight simulator, except instead of flying planes, you were endlessly running from saber-toothed cats or fending off snakes. These night rehearsals may have actually improved survival odds, because when a real attack came, your brain had already experienced it in some warped nocturnal dress rehearsal. Of course, this meant cavemen often woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced that the world itself was conspiring against them. In a way, it was. Archaeological evidence provides small but fascinating clues. Charcoal patterns in ancient hearths suggest that fire burned inconsistently during the night, casting moving shadows that would have looked like dancing figures on cave walls. Imagine falling asleep with the glow of a fire licking against the stone, only to dream of figures creeping closer. That blurry overlap of visual perception and dream imagery could explain why nightmares often featured shadowy attackers. The conditions of cave life itself provided the raw material for bad dreams. Add to that the fact that many caves amplified sound in strange ways, and you have an acoustic horror show. The crack of a log or the drip of water could echo into a booming groan, stitched into the nightmare narrative as a monster waiting in the dark. Neurobiology adds another cruel twist. The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for processing fear, is more active during REM sleep than during waking hours. That means your Stone Age brain wasn't calming down at night. It was turning the volume knob on terror up to 11. Researchers today even note that people living in high-stress environments report more frequent and more vivid nightmares. For cavemen, stress was constant. Hunger, predators, and rival groups ensured that bedtime was rarely peaceful. The same neural machinery that kept them sharp during the day made the night a terrifying theatre of imaginary threats. Nightmares also carried physical consequences. Sleep deprivation was a serious risk if dreams became too vivid or frightening. People who could not rest properly were more likely to make mistakes, to stumble while hunting, or to misjudge a predator's distance. In this way, nightmares may have created a vicious cycle. Stress produced nightmares, nightmares reduced sleep, and poor sleep increased stress. The body punished itself in the name of survival. Modern sleep researchers find similar patterns in people with PTSD. The brain cannot let go of trauma, so it endlessly replays it in sleep. If that is the case for modern soldiers, it is not hard to imagine how much more brutal it would have been for prehistoric hunters constantly surrounded by real threats. Nightmares also shaped culture. Anthropologists studying dream reports in hunter-gatherer groups today note that bad dreams are often interpreted as messages or warnings. A nightmare about an animal attack may be understood as advice from the spirits to avoid a certain area. This could have been the origin of taboos, rituals, and superstitions. When entire groups began to treat nightmares as omens, they invented ways to respond. Charms, chants, or changes in behaviour all became tied to nocturnal visions. In this way, nightmares may have been one of the earliest engines of religion. After all, if your dreams seemed more terrifying and real than waking life, it was logical to believe they were messages from something greater than yourself. Even nutrition may have influenced nightmare culture. Studies of modern populations show that diets high in certain plants or stimulants can increase the frequency and vividness of bad dreams. Prehistoric diets were unstable, often heavy on certain roots, berries, or fermented foods depending on season and luck. If you stumbled across hallucinogenic mushrooms or plants with psychoactive properties, your sleep could turn into a cinematic horror reel. Add in spoiled meat, parasites, and contaminated water, and prehistoric digestion alone was enough to guarantee restless, bizarre nights. Researchers suspect that some of the earliest myths about evil spirits and creatures might have been born not from real encounters, but from the collective indigestion of a group that shared the same bad meal. There is also evidence that fevers from infection made nightmares worse. Fossilized remains reveal clear signs of diseases that would have caused high fevers, such as tuberculosis and malaria. Fever dreams are a special category of nightmare, where the body's temperature changes distort perception. Hallucinations mix with dreams until the sleeper cannot tell the difference between sickness and the supernatural. For a caveman, this meant seeing demonic figures crowding the cave, or hearing whispers in the dark when in reality they were delirious from infection. These terrifying visions would have been shared with the group and retold around the fire, further cementing nightmares as communal experiences rather than private ones. At the cultural level, nightmares probably encourage storytelling. What better way to bond a group together than to recount the strange, frightening visions of the night before? Dreams and nightmares became early social glue. They explained what could not be explained, and they offered ways to prepare for dangers that might strike again. In this sense, nightmares were not accidents. They were educational tools, social rituals, and biological inevitabilities all at once. The fear they generated gave shape to early myth, early religion, and early culture. Without nightmares, humans may never have developed the collective imagination needed to build the first stories of gods, monsters, and heroes. Think of it this way. The next time you wake from a bad dream about something as absurd as being late to work in your underwear, remember that your ancestors woke from equally absurd dreams of being eaten alive by beasts with glowing eyes. They invented nightmares long before they invented language, and those nightmares were the first flickering steps toward understanding a world that refused to make sense. They were terrifying, yes, but they also became the earliest forms of memory, myth, and cultural warning systems. Without them, you might not even be here to suffer through your own bad dreams today. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. If you enjoyed being dragged through the prehistoric invention of nightmares, let me know down in the comments which historical misery you'd like me to cover next. Do you want more cavemen suffering, or should we move on to the medieval peasants inventing new ways to regret their lives? I'm taking requests, so surprise me. And if you enjoy falling asleep to stories of lice, plagues, and humanity's questionable life choices, make sure to check out my other videos. Nothing says sweet dreams quite like knowing our ancestors were just as miserable as we are, only itchier.